Good afternoon, everybody. We're so happy to have all of you on the East Coast joining us. I know we have people across the United States, so good morning to all of you. And we also have some from Japan, so we very much appreciate your dedication to joining us at such a late hour. My name is Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs here at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Sasakawa USA's mission is to deepen the understanding of and strengthen the relationship between the US and Japan, focusing mainly on security and diplomacy within the Asia-Pacific context. We do this through events, exchanges, publications, and networking. We are pleased to have you join us today with our featured speakers, Ms. Kathryn Tolbert and retired Colonel Jyuji Hewitt, to discuss Japanese war brides, bridges in the post-war alliance. We have a diverse audience today, ranging from former and current US military and government officials, members of the US and Japanese media, leadership in the U.S. Japan nonprofit sector, academics in the U.S. and Japan, and executives from private companies, to name a few. Ms. Tolbert, Colonel Hewitt, and I look forward to the diverse questions and engaging conversation that is sure to follow. So let's get to why we are all here today. It is my honor to introduce Ms. Kathryn Tolbert, an editor at the Washington Post and executive director of the nonprofit organization, the War Bride Experience, Inc., which documents the sacrifices and accomplishments of the tens of thousands of Japanese women who married US servicemen after World War II. She is also the author of an oral history archive called the War Bride Project and co-directed the 2015 documentary, Fall 7 Times, Get Up 8, The Japanese War Brides. Ms. Tolbert's passion of ensuring tremendous stories of Japanese war brides is not forgotten, combined with her long professional career in journalism, come together in a meaningful way for the history of US-Japan relations. Sasakawa USA is deeply appreciative for her time today to share these important stories of the war brides and the transformative impact on the communities around the US they entered and became a part of. So thank you so much, Ms. Tolbert. Next, I am pleased to introduce Colonel Jyuji Hewitt, who served over 28 years in the US Army and throughout his career was stationed in Japan, Korea, Germany, Kuwait, and Iraq. Following his active Army service, Colonel Hewitt was selected for the Senior Executive Service for the Army and served in several executive positions, culminating as the Executive Deputy to the Commanding General, US Army Research, Development, and Engineering Command. As the son of a Japanese war bride, we thank you, Colonel Hewitt, for joining us today to share your personal story and insight into the legacy of Japanese war brides on US-Japan relations. And with that, Ms. Tolbert, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining the event and to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA for hosting me. I especially thank Dr. Satohiro Akimoto for taking an interest in this unusual topic for a foundation devoted to diplomacy and national security. I intend to show today that this generation of Japanese immigrants played an important role in the growth of the US-Japan alliance in the decades after World War II. I'm a journalist, as you've heard. I've worked in Tokyo, New York, and Washington, where I'm currently an editor at the Washington Post. And for the past 6 years, I've been gathering stories and telling the stories of that generation of Japanese women, the war brides who married servicemen after the end of World War II. The project is a multimedia project that has included the short documentary film, the oral history archive, and is being considered for a traveling exhibition by the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Service. I have two collaborators on the project, Lucy Kraft and Karen Kosmowski. And you heard that speaking with me today is Mr. Jyuji Hewitt, whose mother married an American soldier in Japan in 1954. And his family is representative in many ways of the experiences of tens of thousands of others in the way that her family objected very strongly to the marriage. His parents come from vastly different kinds of backgrounds, and the family melded cultural traditions. And I created an audio slide story about his parents that I'll play in just a bit. So it's my bias as a journalist that I believe that that personal stories are the best way to tell the impact of policy. And so I'm going to share my screen I'm going to use these stories to talk about the Japanese women who arrived in the United States between 1946 and 1959 as bridges in Japan's tradition from wartime enemy to ally. And I'm going to do this in 3 parts. First is the role of the US military and US immigration policy and the relationships between servicemen and Japanese women. The military is sometimes ahead of American society at large, certainly in desegregating the armed forces in 1948. But in the case of the Japanese women, the military was caught between US immigration laws and attitudes and the reality of what was happening on the ground, with a deployment of several 100,000 US servicemen in Japan in 1945. Second, I will show how the dawn of the Cold War and shifting US foreign policy changed attitudes toward war brides from Japan. And finally, I'll talk about how this group of Japanese immigrants played a role in changing public opinion in the United States following years of anti-Japanese wartime propaganda. The war brides I give as examples have stories in my oral history website. Maybe you've heard the phrase, the immigrant phrase used by activists and authors for decades, "We are here because you were there." Foreign women married US servicemen during and after the major wars of the last century, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. My focus is World War II and the Japanese, because those were the first large numbers of interracial marriages at a time when they were illegal in most of the United States and Asian immigrants were banned from entry. My mother married an American GI in 1951. I've written about her for the Washington Post, and she was the spark for my broader interest in this group of immigrants, who are mostly referred to as a footnote in Asian American history. But they are an important group. If you think about it, Asians were banned from entry since 1924 by the Asian Exclusion Act. And then the first significant numbers of Asian immigrants in more than 2 decades were Japanese women. It's remarkable when you think about it that there was no Asian immigration, and then suddenly thousands of Japanese women entered the United States as wives of US servicemen. Their impact has been overlooked in the changing relationship between Japan and the United States in the decades following World War II. And I believe they are a unique window into understanding both US-Japan relations and the process of assimilating new citizens. First of all, the term war brides is a misnomer, because while many of the marriages in Europe took place before the end of the war, in Japan, the largest number took place in the 1950s during the last couple of years of the occupation and throughout the rest of the decade. But I use the term war bride because it captures their common experience in the United States, that of arriving in the United States as a bride of a serviceman and becoming part of an American community. In the case of the Japanese women, they were arriving in a post-war society that was on the cusp of the civil rights movement, that still legally discriminated on the basis of race. The term war bride originated in World War I, when US troops were sent to France. The military struggled then, as it did later in World War II, with relationships between American men and local women, and tried to prevent the marriages. But by the time the troops were being demobilized in 1919, the US military was housing and shipping home French war brides. As has happened repeatedly, the military gained new responsibility for civilian dependence. During and after the Second World War, nearly 1 million US servicemen married foreign women. In 1945, Congress passed the War Brides Act, which permitted servicemen to bring home foreign-born wives. That year, the War Department announced that transport of alien spouses would begin in 1946. Asians, however, were not included in this legislation because they were not eligible for US citizenship. More than 100,000 GIs married British women. Even brides from Germany were part of this wave, and although controversial at first, more than 14,000 were admitted under the War Brides Act. It was during this period that the military instituted a new rule that servicemen abroad needed the approval of their commander to marry, and that approval was not easy to get. In Japan, US servicemen stationed in every corner of the country, starting in 1945, were meeting, dating, and wanting to marry Japanese women. It was inevitable. The vast military infrastructure hired local women as clerks, typists, secretaries, waitresses, and housemaids. In surrounding neighborhoods, bars and dance halls catered to the Americans and other allied personnel. The US military did not officially ban fraternization with local women, but it did make an attempt to discourage it. A Stars and Stripes article described an order in March 1946 banning public displays of affection between US soldiers and Japanese women. The article concluded, quote, "The order came as Japan had its first day of real spring weather with Tokyo and Yokohama streets filled with couples," unquote. It was never consistently enforced. General MacArthur, meanwhile, pointedly declined to issue a general order against fraternization. His interpreter, Fabian Bowers, described being in the car with MacArthur and passing a GI embracing a Japanese young woman. Quote, "Look at that," the general said. "They keep trying to get me to stop all this Madam Butterflying around too. I won't do it. My father told me never to give an order unless I was certain it would be carried out. I wouldn't issue a no fraternization order for all the tea in China," unquote. But permanent bonds were definitely discouraged, and the military tried to make it difficult for the men to marry through bureaucratic obstacles or military transfers. The paperwork was extensive even by military standards, requiring the woman to have a medical exam, to be interviewed by a chaplain for letters attesting to character. These are some of the papers saved by Sidney Jordan, who married Kazue Shibata in 1951. As I said, Asian women were excluded from the War Brides Act because of the racist immigration laws that deemed them ineligible for US citizenship. I was going to point out on the top of this pile of papers is the certification from the chaplain that he's interviewed the Kazue Shibata on the responsibilities of marriage. It's quite a stack of papers. So the way servicemen could get around the ban on Asian immigration was by special permission, which took the form of private bills. Families petitioned their congressman for help in exempting an individual Japanese woman from that ban. Then Congressman John F. Kennedy sponsored such a bill in 1950 for Kimiko Yamaguchi, who was engaged to marry Angelo Amato of East Boston. Another problem was the fact that more than half the states had anti-miscegenation laws on the books, making marriages between races illegal, including between Asians and whites. When Joseph Elliott of Montana wanted to marry Hisako Furuya in 1947, he was initially denied permission because of Montana's law banning interracial marriages. Elliott even petitioned the governor, getting coverage in the Montana newspapers, but to no avail. He eventually did receive permission in Japan to marry, apparently by telling his commander that they did not intend to live in Montana. He and his bride settled in Washington state. Back in DC, pressure was building to remove racial discrimination from the immigration law. Exceptions were made for a small number of Chinese because of China's role as an ally. And several temporary laws were enacted that allowed servicemen to bring Japanese wives home within a narrow window of time. One of these was in 1947 as an amendment to the War Brides Act, permitting foreign wives of servicemen to enter the US, quote, regardless of race, unquote. This was potentially groundbreaking, but lawmakers did not want to encourage such marriages and set a tight deadline with lengthy application requirements. The Associated Press reported that 831 couples succeeded in getting the paperwork done, and that included Joseph Elliott of Montana, who was married in 1947. 1952 was a big year. That's when the Mccarran Walter Act passed, which, while continuing the much criticized racial immigration quotas, contained the right for Asians to apply to become US citizens. And as a result, it made it possible for Japanese to get visas to enter the United States for the first time since 1924. This Immigration and Naturalization Service chart shows the number of wives year by year. It does not include fiancés. If you use even just the numbers recorded here, the immigration of Japanese women by 1959 increased the population of Asian Americans in the United States by around 12%. But even after 1952, when legal barriers to immigration were removed, military commanders tried to discourage marriages, sometimes acting on what they considered to be the best interests of the young men under them, who they felt did not fully grasp the difficulties of an interracial marriage in the United States. But GIs were persistent, and Jyuji Hewitt's parents are one example. This is the audio story I created about them.
My name is Clark Hewitt, and I met my wife Akiko at the Jyuji Proving Grounds in Kanazawa, Japan.
My name is Akiko. Matsuda is maiden name.
I was standing by a desk talking to one of the other soldiers. The phone rang, and we both turned to Akiko and told her to pick it up and answer it. She said, "But I can't speak English." Answer it anyway. She picked up the phone and answered the phone in perfect English. That's how I noticed her.
And my English was so formal. "Whom may I say speaking, please?" No, the GI laughed at me.
I started trying to court her, and I was a smoker. She wouldn't go out on a date with me. I was sitting on the trash can next to her typewriter one day, and just something on the look on her face, I reached down and put the cigarette out, and I haven't smoked since. It's been 62 years. I'd probably get arrested nowadays for courting her the way I did, but I used to leave a note in her typewriter, and she'd take it home and get the dictionary out, and then
He keep on putting a letter in typewriter, and I'm beginning to understand he's after me for something.
Dated for a while. I kept trying to talk her into agreeing to marry me, and one night in the middle of a snowstorm in the middle of a park, she finally agreed to marry me.
I don't know why, but I said yes. It's a part of something new, something more than what I have now. I was born in a very strict family, a samurai family. It was very limited for the thinking and doing. More I learned from him, there was something that out there, something I have never seen or did, and that attracted me.
The colonel that commanded the little detachment that we had took our best interpreter over and told the family that I was too young to be trustworthy and all of that sort of stuff, and that he shouldn't give his permission for me to marry her. And me trying to follow tradition, the next day I took the same interpreter over to talk to her father.
I was upstairs, sitting on the top of the stairs, listening.
And asked for his permission to marry her, and he says, "What if I say no?" And I said, "I'll marry her anyway." He said, "That's what I thought." I found out later that after her father had held those twins, one on each knee, and one was named for him, the next thing I knew, I found my name in her family history.
So he's in a Japanese family registry.
What can I say?
And this is the Koseki of the family, and Clark Philip Hewitt is in katakana there down the left hand side. And Clark believes it was naming Giuji after his grandfather that softened the old military man's attitude toward an American son-in-law. So with the rise of the post-war Soviet threat and the war in Korea, US foreign policy shifted to a Cold War policy of recasting Japan as an ally and bulwark against communism. This audience knows that period well. It's a change that also carried over to the official attitude toward war brides. One of the most visible in the occupation force was the effort to instruct and welcome Japanese brides through bride schools. First by the Christian Women's Association of Tokyo, and then starting in 1951 by the Red Cross. The goal of these courses that lasted 6 or 8 weeks was to make it easier for the Japanese bride to adjust to American ways. The wives of US officers became instructors in classes aimed at teaching Japanese women how to become American housewives. This was both part of the new alliance and also part of the post-World War II emphasis on a return to domesticity in the US. The officers' wives had actually written a textbook about American housekeeping during the early years of the occupation. The purpose was to train Japanese maids working in officers' homes and contained chapters on cleaning the house, care of electric equipment, care of clothing, care of children, as well as recipes. Other mimeograph texts were produced for the bride schools that covered US geography and customs in addition to housekeeping. Reflecting changing official attitudes, the classes also conveyed the message that the women should value their Japanese culture and bring it to the United States. From the class materials for one bride school under the chapter Customs and Manners, quote, "We American wives in Japan think of ourselves as ambassadors from the United States. Conversely, each of you will be an ambassador from Japan when you go to the United States. You have a wonderful history. You have a wonderful heritage of history and culture. Be proud of it. You have many centuries of culture as your background. Do remember that always," unquote. This chapter also tells them to take Japanese treasures with them and that their skills in Japanese arts will be admired. These special schools enrolled only a fraction of the thousands of brides, and they reflected the paternalistic view that some Americans took toward Japanese women. But the women I interviewed described the classes as fun, and they also said that it appeared that the officers' wives liked teaching them. The Japanese women largely accepted the view that they were moving to a land of immense wealth to become housewives, baking cakes, and presiding over a middle-class Western home. Bride schools didn't dwell on the reality that some women would follow new husbands to rural backwaters without houses. Many of the women were more educated and from wealthier families than their GI husbands. The women were more often than not city girls, and their image of America was rooted in the popular Hollywood movies of the time. Imagine growing up in Kyoto and moving to a logging community in Wisconsin or Montana, or moving to a struggling dairy farm. Here's Wakako Kondo Burke, daughter of a commander in Japan's Imperial Navy, with her new family in Northwest Montana. The women were also unprepared for racial segregation, and a significant number of women married Black GIs. Chizuko Watkins couldn't find her husband at a Greyhound bus station until she asked a porter because she didn't see any Black people. She was directed to a separate waiting room around back. Women were also confused by signs indicating white and colored bathrooms or drinking fountains and asked their husbands which to use. They were told to use the white ones. The US military tried to station war bride families outside the Deep South, where mixed race marriage was still a punishable offense. As a result, many career military families landed at bases in the Northeast or on the two coasts. But despite their shock at the change in circumstances, they made the best of what they had, and they played an important role in the changing image of Japan in American public opinion. Because in the 1950s, the American popular view of Japan was changing. Japan was both a former opponent, but now a Cold War ally, and Japanese women represented the soft and least threatening side of Japan. For the American public, the new image would be shaped by Japanese women, by the photographs in magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, and in small town newspapers everywhere. Journalists wrote that they would become good Americans. The Saturday Evening Post splashed a big article under the headline, "They're bringing home Japanese wives." James Michener wrote about them in Life magazine. But it is often said that these women then disappeared into America. And the point I want to make is that they didn't disappear from Main Street America. They were known in their communities in places like Hiles, Wisconsin, Kalispell, Montana, Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. And they contributed to the changing image of Japan in three ways: through the jobs they found, through the food they cooked and shared, and through volunteering in their communities. So many of them worked as seamstresses, waitresses, and factory workers. Sometimes they had to supplement their husband's salary. Often they wanted to work outside the home because if you think about it, they are here in this country without family of their own, and their circle of acquaintances is limited at first to their husbands' families. Taking a job gave them a community of co-workers and a connection to people outside their American in-laws and the husband's relatives, among whom there were varying degrees of welcome. In workplaces, they earned a reputation as good and hard workers. In rural Illinois, Itsuko Yoder was one of 4 people hired among the dozens of applicants for a job at a new factory making wire coils. She worked there for more than 30 years, supplementing the family's income from a small dairy farm. In Maine, Keiko Ingerson was the first female barber most men had ever had when she was hired by Roger Blay after he observed her skills at Topsom Air Force Station. The two competed in hairstyling competitions and won trophies. In Minnesota, Yoko Breckenridge was the only female barber in Redwood, written up in the local newspaper, before she became a successful real estate agent and founder of the Japanese Lending Library in Minneapolis. And in Montana, Kazuko Aho, Wakako Burke, and Haruko Frith became waitresses and cooks in the town of Kalispell, at the Elks Lodge, and across the street at the Outlaw Inn, where they were regularly featured as star employees. When Kazuko Aho and her husband Jim opened a small restaurant called Highway Hostess, they advertised Oriental specials every Friday night, a dinner set with miso soup and a salad. Their daughter said it always drew a crowd. These women, by the way, drove from Montana to Seattle periodically to stock up on Japanese ingredients. Food from home is central to every immigrant's life, and no different for these Japanese women who tried to create dishes without authentic ingredients. Spaghetti became soba noodles. Some even carried a large tin of Kikkoman soy sauce with them in the 2 pieces of luggage they were allowed to bring on military transport. From 1949 to 1954, soy sauce imports from Japan increased 33%, most of it from Kikkoman. Kikkoman opened a factory in Walworth, Wisconsin in 1973 and published a book that year called The Kikkoman Way of Fine Eating, Discover a New World of Flavor with Brewed Soy Sauce. The cover showed an American white dad, a Japanese mother, and their children. In America at the time, Japanese post-war brides and their families represented racial integration and cultural pluralism. I'd like to offer one other example of goodwill ambassadorship before turning the conversation over to Giuji. Mike and Tsuchino Forrester of Seattle. Mike has written about meeting Tsuchino and his efforts to get permission to marry her in the late 1950s in the book, Tsuchino, My Japanese War Bride. It's interesting that he had so many problems years after it was legal for Japanese to enter the US. Even after getting permission to marry, he wasn't allowed to live off base with her. His conclusion was that there was someone higher up in the chain of command in the Air Force who didn't like that he was marrying a Japanese woman and made it difficult for him. Mike feels strongly that in the 1950s, these women showed the average American that what they knew about Japan was not true. Ordinary people saw them and their children as hardworking, family-oriented people, not much different than they were. Their children studied hard in school and their families moved up the socioeconomic ladder. In Mike's words, before you knew it, people were eating sushi and enjoying Japanese cooking. He said, I remember one of my younger brothers after they met Tsuchino saying, Japan must be cool. But Tsuchino and other Japanese of this new immigrant group volunteered at soup kitchens, at nursing homes, at local festivals, and helped raise money for local charities. In the 1990s, Tsuchino was invited to become a member of the Board of Directors of the Japanese Community Services of Seattle. Today in their 80s, Mike and Tsuchino are still weekly volunteers at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center in Seattle, or they were before the pandemic. These are the lives that made a difference in how Japan is perceived in far corners of the United States. And one family that has been part of that is the Hewitt family. Akiko and Clark Hewitt today live in the small town of Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, where their family business is Akiko's Floral Arts. They raised 8 children, starting with the twins, Giuji and his brother, William. So here I'm going to invite Giuji to take over and talk about his family. And here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jyuji Hewitt, the second born of the twins of Clark and Akiko Hewitt. And before I start, just want to point out the background that I am using is Genrokuin Gardens, which is in Ishikawa Prefecture of Kanazawa. And I use this background because it's in homage to my mother, who is from Kanazawa. What you see before you is a picture of us as scouts, as a young family. My dad is a warrant officer, United States Army. And I would call my background and upbringing with a term of affection, that of the military brat. We moved often, and often to various military bases across the United States. We lived in Okinawa, El Paso, Austin, Texas. And then we moved up to the Northeast to Beverly, Massachusetts, Rehoboth, Massachusetts, and finally in Coventry, Rhode Island, where my father finally retired from the United States Army. In all of these military communities, we were within a military housing base. And often these were our neighbors, were also friends, and the soldiers were also members of the military unit that supported that particular base. So there was always a common bond, a sense of unity amongst all of us, and we all worked very hard. And it was not unusual to have mixed marriage families amongst us in these military communities. But that really didn't matter so much, because what was important was, of course, readiness, our dads being in the military, supporting that mission, whatever they were doing at that time. Later, my dad, after he had retired, took a job with the Boy Scouts of America, and his first assignment was up in Maine. And we moved to Dixfield, Maine, a small town which had a single mill. Actually, it made the little spools for thread at one time. And this was a very small school. And this was our first real exposure to what I call it the small town USA. We didn't have the same cocoon of other military families surrounding us. We were in that particular small town. And later we went, this was during my high school years. And then later my parents moved with my dad being transferred from Dixfield, Maine to Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. So again, Wellsboro is not a very large town, but it was a town where our family had to integrate within the community of Wellsboro. Now, Mom didn't speak Japanese at home. She felt it was very important to speak English so that we all learned the English language. It was important in terms of schooling to make sure that we understood and we were able to succeed in school. Success was a very important part of our upbringing. We may not have been the smartest kids, but we would certainly outwork everyone to get good grades. And that, as you see, even with this picture here, many of my brothers were all attained the rank of Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts. So this was an attitude that was brought into all of us as we were being raised. Mom also supported the school system. She volunteered often. She would teach origami to the schools when we would do art classes. When in geography, we would talk about Japan. She often volunteered to talk about Japan. She would bring some of her artifacts to show and tell to many of our classes. And then as we grew older and we invite friends over, she would cook a meal such as sukiyaki and explain the ritual of a sharing meal with friends. And to this day, I can't think of one friend who disliked Japanese food. As a matter of fact, some of them they felt was a little strange with the glass noodles and that sort of thing within the sukiyaki, but they all always enjoyed it. And it was kind of an opening of understanding what Japanese was all about. You see, many of my friends had a sensing of what Japan was all about through movies, television shows, and the like. And that sort of put in a sense of that's what you're supposed to be like. And I think our upbringing, no, that's not true. We are not one. I could recall always going through school. The first day of school was my toughest day because I had the first name of Giuji, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But the first day of school, the teacher would go through the opening roll, and then there was a pause. And I knew the teacher came to my name. I would slowly raise my hand and explain, my name is Giuji. Of course, all the kids would laugh. And I could recall coming back to my mom and says, how come you couldn't name me Robert or something? But as I grew up, I understood that that name was who I was, and it gave me a sense of identity as I learned to grow older. Now, we go on into how we all became in the military. 6 out of the 8 of us kids joined the military. And as you see in this picture, we all had very successful military careers, with Clark Jr. in the front there as a sergeant first class or a gunny sergeant in the Marine Corps. My younger brother, Timothy, he was a major in the Marine Corps, and I, in this picture, as a lieutenant colonel. So this is our Mother's Day portrait to Mom. And certainly the influence of my father being in the military influenced us to be a part of it, but also that sense of discipline that Mom had talked about. She mentioned that she was from a samurai soldier, very strict. That was part of our upbringing, and that sort of regimen helped all of us in whatever we did, whether it was in scouting, in school. We did well in grades, we played sports, we tried to do the best we can in everything what we did, and certainly it paid off to all of us in our military careers. So in my case, I attained the rank of full colonel and had a very full career in the United States Army. And then at the end of my career, I was offered an opportunity to become a senior executive. I had applied, I was accepted. And because I was accepted into the senior executive service, that was the impetus for me to go ahead and retire from regular Army. And I served another 10 years with the Department of the Army as a senior executive. So here's a picture of Akiko's Floral Arts. You heard Kathryn mention that many of the wives took on jobs. Certainly in our case, Mom took on worked several jobs as we were growing up just to supplement Dad's income. And often she worked these other jobs to provide a little extra money so that we as children could have some additional activities. I can recall when she enrolled all of us into the YMCA so we can learn how to swim better. When we learned how to swim, it certainly helped us in some of the merit badges for scouting, for swimming and life-saving, for example. So she worked these sorts of jobs, and then while she was in Wellsboro, she was given the opportunity to apply to a flower shop, which was on Main Street in Wellsboro, the AAA flower shop. As she continued to work, she found that her business sense and the owner's business sense were not exactly in sync. So she had an opportunity to go in business for herself. She applied for a business license in Harrisburg, got the license. And while my dad was off at summer camp as a camp director, he came back and lo and behold, the living room had been transformed into a shop for Akiko's Floral Arts. Those were the beginning days. Mom was able to apply her skills that she learned both as a child, and she's got a master's degree in horticulture, into the work and put her passion of arranging flowers into Akiko's Floral Arts. And it came that she had an article written in the Wellsboro Gazette about here's a woman born in Japan, came into Wellsboro, and is now applying her skills with a master's degree in horticulture, doing bonsai flowers, silk flowers, some of the things that many people in Wellsboro or even in the county had never seen with respect to flower arranging and floral arts. And her business, I would say, took off. She became very, very popular as the place to come to if you wanted flowers. And that philosophy continues today. It's her business sense that came in to help us in all of that. I mentioned my name. Here's a kanji for my name, Giuji. You saw the picture with me on the lap of my grandfather, Giuji, the namesake. Now, loosely speaking, my name means one on top of the other. My grandmother said I was first in, last out, if you will. But the name Giuji is certainly unusual for many, many kids. And I mentioned that I wanted to be named Robert or something. But as we grow older, we start to look for identity. And I didn't have far to go. I had an unusual name. And certainly when I was in college, as everyone is looking for that sense of individuality, Giuji made me who I am. And certainly helpful was the James Clavell miniseries Shogun came out. And I think that started to open up again a little more of what Japan was all about, some of the culture and the foods and the way of thinking and the way of life of Japan. And I think the American people started to understand a little bit more of what Japan was all about. I now embrace the name. If I were to get a tattoo, this is what I would have tattooed on my arm. Being a soldier at the time, you know, tattoos were not weren't very popular, of course. And we come in, and here's a family photo of a few years ago at a wedding of my nephew. The person sitting in the middle was Patrick. His son got married. We all were able to come in, and you see, all of us were successful. Two of my brothers went to a brother and sister went to the Naval Academy. I had a 4-year ROTC scholarship. My twin brother at the time was a chief operating officer or president for auto parts manufacturer in Michigan. My brother Patrick in the middle there was a superintendent in school. So the legacy of what Mom had inspired in all of this is to work hard and be who you are, and you can be successful. And that's what you see in this photo. Successful brothers and sisters all making a difference in their communities wherever we live. So I'm very proud of what Mom has done. And she's raised, and I know she is extremely proud of us as a family. My dad certainly is. And with that, I'm more than willing to entertain questions when we get to that point.
Thank you so much. And Giuji, you have a twin brother, and his name
is William.
I see. Okay. that
was my pet peeve. He was named William. I was named Giuji. I was the one who went through life with the Japanese first name, but his middle name is Hajime, which means first.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to close our presentation by posing the question about what the legacy is for this group of immigrants. They were not mere passive recipients of opportunity, but they firmly held agency over their lives, choosing a non-traditional path in life. They showed a quiet, very determined feminism because so many of them worked outside the home and did volunteer work. They also served as representatives of what Japan meant to lots of Americans who had no other reference point, particularly in small towns in the interior of the US. Almost all brought the Japanese Gambaru spirit, a dedication to endure and do their best. For many Americans, this war bride brought home by their son, nephew, or cousin was the first Asian they ever met. And after knowing this single Japanese woman, most families embraced and positively changed their perspective of Japan and Japanese families. Some of these women were publicly recognized. Kazuko Umezu Stout, who formed the Nikkei International Marriage Society, received an invitation to a tea ceremony for an association of Japanese living abroad, where Empress Michiko said to her, "It must have been so hard for you all in a country where you didn't know the language or customs. Tell everyone that we're proud of you." Yoko Breckenridge was awarded the Mondale Award for Japan-Minnesota Partnership in 2016, named after Joan and Walter Mondale. But most were not more widely recognized and lived quiet lives as citizens and wives and mothers. In this role as the face of Japan in the decades after World War II, they helped create a new image of Japan and the Japanese. They were not ambassadors crisscrossing the Pacific. They were at home, and their impact through people-to-people diplomacy was just as vital as trade and official diplomacy as a means of bringing countries closer and increasing mutual understanding. This is Japanese grassroots diplomacy that is homegrown in America by a generation of women. And these are the Japanese women's voices that are seldom heard in telling the story of U.S.-Japan relations. So I thank you again, Dr. Akimoto and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, for giving me the opportunity to tell this story. If you are interested in further reading, I have a bibliography I can share with these titles. And now I think we have time for a few questions.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Tolbert and Colonel Hewitt. That was such an educational and touching presentation. And I'm sure I speak for many here today when I say hearing the personal stories of these courageous women and the sacrifices they have made for their families is inspiring, to say the least. also, as you just mentioned, Ms. Tolbert, their contributions of helping to craft a positive understanding of Japan within the US is truly a legacy to be honored and remembered. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I do want to let the audience know I did see several questions that have been put in the chat box, so thank you so much for that. I do have those prepared to ask them, but I did want to start off with Professor Mayo from the University of Maryland, who I know was interested in asking a question.
Just a wonderful presentation. I keep learning and learning all the time from Kathryn. I was particularly interested in the part about the Cold War and also the immigration experience, the contribution to reshaping Japan's image in the United States. And I am of the older generation, which was exposed to Japanese history and Japanese culture in the early 50s in college. And I've always thought of it as a path toward reconciliation after a brutal war and trying to understand the reasons behind the dropping of the atomic bomb. And I think I just wanted to ask to what extent the Japanese war brides may have benefited from soft power. That is, Americans were undertaking quite a cultural soft power program in Japan during and after the occupation. And I think perhaps the Japanese contribution to that in the United States has been somewhat neglected. Recently, scholars have written about American fascination with Japan, mid-50s, late 50s, a Japan boom in the United States. And in the academic world, there were returning GIs who got degrees, who got interested in Japan during the occupation and earned degrees in Japanese studies. And I later on would benefit from that in that my professor of Japanese history had been in the Navy during the war and had been trained in the Japanese language, although we didn't know it at the time. So to get to the point of all of this, I wondered if Japanese war brides in this period may have been instrumental in the academic world in that they were brought in as informants to help with the study of the Japanese language in particular. There was a real growth of interest in the Japanese language and in East Asian studies in particular. And I'm also interested in private contexts that once the occupation was over, there were efforts in the academic world and also in US diplomacy and Japanese diplomacy to engage in equal exchange. And in 1953, very much in this period and very crucial to changes in laws, a US Japan intellectual exchange program was inaugurated, which brought Japan's #1 feminist to the United States, Ichikawa Fusai, and which brought the, at that time, the most admired woman in the world, Eleanor Roosevelt, to Japan. That's 1953. And so I think there's an agency, Japanese cultural associations and Japanese tourist associations and so on, which were helping to create a more positive image of Japan in the United States, as well as American State Department policy, helping to craft this new image. And so it's so different from the lives that the picture brides, for example, had to live in the United States prior to World War II. So I'm just, it's such a nuance and such an interesting interaction.
Right. No, it's fascinating. And thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, you know, when you think about it, sort of the image of Japan in this country, and I was just rereading part of Sheila Johnson's book, The Japanese Through American Eyes, and it does talk about in the 1950s and, you know, how Rashomon opened in New York in 1951, and there was a kabuki troupe that also arrived in New York, and the Museum of Modern Art set up a Japan House. So there was that big sort of cultural, these events taking place. But on a much smaller, so you talked about sort of the role that Japanese brides played in sort of teaching the language. And you know, when I studied Japanese at Vassar, Japanese was not taught as a course with a professor. It was considered a critical language or something. Anyway, it was independent study. And I went into Poughkeepsie every day and sat in the back room of a jewelry shop run by a Japanese woman and her American husband. And she, you know, she tutored me. And I think about, you know, but then when you talk about kind of that post-war generation, the academics who were trained during the war in Japanese and sort of made that whole generation of scholars, and even like in Minnesota around Fort Snelling and places where they had, you know, the big Japanese language training programs, and that community continued. I mean, the people who went there for training, many of them stayed, and many of them were, you know, international marriages. You know, Minnesota now, Minneapolis has a very vibrant Japanese community. I think that whole thing is fascinating when you think about kind of the way Japan is portrayed and how it affects people like the Japanese. You know, the Japanese immigrants are both part of it, recipients of it, and contribute to it, I would say. Yeah, I mean, and Giuji mentioned, you know, the impact of the James Clavell novel and series. So that's all part of the picture, which is, you know, really fascinating to me. Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you.
Marlene, if I may add, I think the important thing that we're trying to portray here is that in small town America, the education of the student, the young people throughout the school learning about Japan was so important. And that's kind of what happened with the families that are coming into those small communities. Because from a Washington, D.C. speak, we have the policies and everything of what we're trying to do. And from a top level, it's working very hard. But the very bottom, the grassroots where the education was taking place, that's where the rubber met the road in terms of what needed to happen in order to turn around the attitudes between the United States and Japan.
Thank you very much. I think that small town emphasis is really, really important. I grew up in a large city, Detroit, and went to an urban university, and where I have subsequently learned there was a Japanese American community. But so it works both ways in the bigger cities and in small town America. So it makes it more widespread. It's fascinating. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We have more questions coming in, so I'm trying to field them as they come in. But we did have two questions a little bit around the same topic, so I wanted to combine them. They were from Fath Ruffins, a curator at Smithsonian, and Michaela Woodward, senior exhibit developer at Wing Luke Museum, and kind of regarding the women role in all of this. So first, from Fath Ruffins, she was interested in having Colonel Hewitt talk a little about the experience of his sisters. How did they experience being mixed race girls and growing up? What was their notion of womanhood? And the second question was, you noted, Colonel Hewitt, that your mother has a master's, and Michaela was curious if it was a challenge for her to pursue that master's despite moving all the time and having kids.
So I think the master's degree was earned by mother prior to her coming to the United States. I mean, that was one of the skill sets that she brought with her. So she always had that, and I mentioned a little bit that she had the contest with her brothers well, maybe I didn't mention that, but when she was young, she would have a contest about flower arranging where each of her brothers and sisters were given the same set of flowers and materials. And her older brother was already a judge. So the brothers and sisters would do these sorts of flower arranging, and her brother would judge them. So that was a little bit of the skill that Mom had brought into the United States with her. And I think she had that master's degree as well as she came in. I'd have to ask her in particular if she earned it on I don't believe she did. I think she had that coming into the United States. The second question about my sisters, I can say that I don't think they had any trouble getting dates. So they assimilated fairly well in their schools. It's an interesting question because with me, with my name, you know, I would be teased, but I think all of us got teased. I think when we had the Vietnam War coming in, there was a little bit of that aggression, a little bit, you know, because we were Asian or of Asian descent, you know, there was some animosity would come up, but not personal, but that sort of thing would come up from time to time. But I don't think from a personal standpoint, there was any sort of hatred. It was kind of the way we portrayed our enemies in many of the newscasts and the like, and that may have had a spillover effect, if you will. I hope that answered the question.
All right, thank you so much. I know it's 12:58 and we are scheduled to go until 1 p.m., but we still have some great questions, and both Ms. Tolbert and Colonel Hewitt are happy to stay with us for a bit longer. So I am going to extend this. We understand if you need to go, but we will stay for maybe 10 or 15 more minutes just to get through a few more questions. So an interesting one that just came in from Raymond Swenson. It's a little, I'm going to read it, so please forgive me. The 1924 Alien Exclusion Act barred new immigration from Japan and other Asian nations, and was taken as an insult by many Japanese. Until it was finally repealed circa 1952, special bills had to be passed that allowed Japanese war brides to immigrate to the US. Forgive me for the siren in the back. The movie Sayonara, starring Marlon Brando, was focused on the issue. My perception is that the war brides and their integration into many military families with unquestioned loyalty to the United States played a role in ending the prejudice that had engendered the ban in 1924. Would you agree?
Well, the ban in 1924 was part of a long, it came after a long period of greatly increasing anti-Asian hysteria in this country. I mean, the Chinese were banned in the late 1800s. And so the Japanese tried to avoid that same sort of ban through the gentleman's agreement in the early 1900s, and ultimately it didn't work. The fact that the Japanese women, sort of the military families were an important part, I think, of the war bride experience in this country. But again, we're talking much later. I mean, by the time after World War II, I think that a lot of people had forgotten that there was this 1924 ban, and certainly the soldiers in Japan were, you know, struggled mightily against it. But it was, you know, when it was lifted in 1952, it was almost an afterthought. I mean, it got slipped into the Mccarran Walter Act, and sort of almost as an aside, and everybody, you know, Truman vetoed the Mccarran Walter Act, and it still passed. But the Japanese Americans in this country were lobbying for it because it contained the right for Asians to naturalize. So that was the big moment. But yeah. I don't know, this is sort of a roundabout way and not directly answering the question, but I'm happy to continue the conversation in chats or emails, because I know we won't get to everything. And I think people have information that I don't have, and I'd love to continue to talk about it.
Thank you so much. Another question we have is from Anne Imamura. And she said, one of the slides used 1959 as a cutoff, and the footnote indicated this date was suitable because it more or less coincided with brides who had been educated before or during the war and who had experienced the war. Has your research shown significant differences between this cohort and the brides who immigrated shortly thereafter?
There is, I think that the brides who came really through the 1960s had very similar experiences. So I know women who came in 1960, 61, 62, and they still are, I still think of them as part of this, you know, sometimes they're called what, Shin Issei, a new first generation of Japanese women. So I don't use that INS description for the cutoff. You know, by the time we get to 63, 64, and Japan's hosting the Olympics, and by 65, the whole immigration law is changed. So you know, you can really take the number up through the early 60s without a huge difference in the experience. And obviously the Japanese women who came later came for very different reasons, for professional and academic reasons. So that experience is completely different.
All right, thank you so much. And one question that I was curious to ask is, this is for both of you, but specifically Colonel Hewitt, you helped us put a face to and humanize the extraordinary experiences the Japanese war brides like your mother went through, and the families they had. So I'm curious, a generation removed, 2 generations removed, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, you know, how is their grandmother's, great-grandmother's legacy being carried on? I would love to hear from both of you on that.
So let me begin. My answer is going to be a sort of anecdotally, because my brothers and sisters certainly have sons and daughters from their marriages. And I would say that there is a sense of pride that all of them have, you know, 25% Japanese blood in them. There is no longer a sense of, oh, you're Japanese. It's, wow, that's cool. And that's a pure sort of appreciation that they all have. I personally have 2 granddaughters who live out in the Midwest. And one of them has put on a display of Japan, and she is very, very proud to say, I've got some Japanese blood in me, and here are some things from Japan. Here's some cookies, some candies, the shoes. Here's her poster. It's a very different acceptance, 1 generation, 2 generations today, to have that Japanese influence in them personally, in their blood, and also in their understanding and knowing of the family that they have. And I'll turn it over to Kathryn.
And I think that, Giuji, you've also talked about that within one family, there's often big differences in how the kids, you know, feel that connection. And certainly my family is the same way. I'm the eldest and the one who has been interested in my mother's story, and the others not so much. But what I do see in families that I've interviewed is that there's usually somebody in the family who's actively pursuing and trying to understand the mother's story. And for the Japanese war bride story, because it was not widely known or told, they didn't know that their story was shared by anybody else. And there's so many of the families thought that they were really just highly unusual and you know, had this Japanese mom. And so they didn't know others like them. And so that's been, so some of these kids are now, you know, once we can bring some attention to it, you know, they start to say, well, so there's a source of pride. And, you know, there's a family in Wisconsin, rural Wisconsin, and the daughters have become very active in in Yoko Breckenridge's Japanese lending library. And the daughters don't speak Japanese, but they are, you know, they're involved, and they take part in the monthly meetings. And, you know, so it's kind of, you know, I've heard this before, even among sort of the Japanese American communities, that there's a broadening of the Japanese American community and experience. And it's become, I think, much more inclusive of the variety of experiences that families have brought to it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. We have time for just one more question. This comes from Emily Liu, and I think just directed at both of you generally. She said, hi, thank you all for a wonderful session. If I might ask one final question, how did the Japanese perceive of the Japanese war brides? So how were the lives of the women's families, friends, and acquaintances back home in Japan affected by the women's decisions to move to the United States?
I think I can help answer that one in a very good example. In my military career, I had the opportunity to be assigned to Japan. I was at Camp Zama, Japan. And a friend of our family who went to school at Mansfield State University, his family is from Japan, but he came back to Japan and we met him at the train station. And here's what he said. Wow, hi Giuji. In the United States, you look Japanese. In Japan, you look American. And I think that is, I can't put it any better than that comment right there of how we are perceived one way or the other. Because, you know, while I was stationed, you know, the term gaijin was used often and everything. So that is still there. But it's a part of who we are, the fact that we are a blend of two cultures, and it's not a perfect fit in any box. We are a new culture in of itself within Japan. And I'll go to Kathryn for that, but that's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, well, it's different now than obviously than it was in the immediate post-war years. And now most Japanese don't know about the Japanese war brides and that experience. And so the college students generation are interested and had never heard of it before. But the immediate post-war years, it was a very fraught issue, and the Japanese media portrayed it as women who, you know, were low class, and you know, and obviously it was, you know, the idea that Japanese women would prefer to marry Americans and move to a foreign country. So the word war bride in Japan in those early years took on a very negative connotation, the senso hanayome. And as a result, women who settled in primarily the West Coast in or near existing Japanese American communities did not want to be identified as a war bride. And as I said, it's not an ideal term anyway, even literally. But so in Japan, the image was not a positive one in the early years, but it's interesting how the families came together later. Once that over time, there was so many cases of reconciliation and exploration of ties. So they're really wonderful stories around that. You know, and the women who married Black GIs, they had a lot of hurdles to overcome, both in this country and in Japan. So yeah, the Japanese view of it has changed as well, I think, over time. And yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. So that brings us to the end, and I just want to once again thank you, Ms. Tolbert and Colonel Hewitt, for sharing these wonderful stories with us and letting us know a bit about your personal stories, and Kathryn, the wonderful archive you have spent, I'm sure, thousands of hours putting together. It's really wonderful. We can learn from that. Would both of you like to give just some final remarks quickly before we close?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for this opportunity. It again is another opportunity for us to share who we are, the legacy that we all have, and this is a wonderful experience just to share that. I'm just one of thousands of stories out there, and I'd like to say thank you to my mother and my father for raising us up the way we have been raised to be a part of that. And it's been an honor, and again, thank you to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation.
Yeah, I would like to also thank you. When Dr. Okimoto offered this platform, you know, this was quite a while ago, but he didn't forget that he had offered it, and he then had Shanti call me up and like set a date, and so it was going to happen. But it was a challenge to think about it in terms of this foundation and this audience. But in you know, and the opportunity to present with Giuji was really special, because I am really appreciative this family has been so open in telling their story. And I want to just also end with a shout out to my two colleagues, Lucy Kraft and Karen Kosmowski, because they really you know, jump-started the project 7 or 8 years, maybe longer ago than that, with the idea of the short documentary film. And you know, it's through peers that we sort of learn that the stories, what the universal part of the story is. And so that's been really important to me. And, you know, I'm grateful to them for their role. And we continue to work together and, you know, is take the story as far as we can. So thank you. This has been a great platform, and I really appreciate the event. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you so much to both of you. I know you put a lot of time and effort into this presentation, so thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who joined us. I know there are various virtual events that are out there, and we appreciate you spending an hour and 15 minutes of your time with us today to learn about this important topic. We will be posting the video, a recording of this video, and a recap on our website. So if you'd like to share with others, that's possible. And lastly, Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, we're always looking at topics that all of you are interested in hearing about and delving into, such as in today's event. So if you have topics you're interested in, please reach out to me, and I would love to hear from you. So with that, thank you again, and have a joyous and safe holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you.